Hello, hello. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. For the last day of our 21st Informal ASEM seminar on human rights with the team on human rights and climate change. I hope you have enjoyed the last 2 days and especially yesterday also the working groups. And then, of course, for those who are here in Luxembourg, also the cultural program. So for this morning, we have basically 3 items. The first one, we will have a presentation of the working group outcomes that will be moderated, thank you, by Ms. Jenny Piaget, who is the head of the Human Rights Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. And then we have a small break, and then we will have a second, the closing discussion and panel, which will be moderated by Rolf Ring from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And then finally, we will have the Minister of Environment of Luxembourg for the closing team. And then, of course, also Mr. Habib Ashtanul from Indonesia. So that is the program for this morning. We will end probably by 12:30. That's at least what the program says. So, but normally we take a little bit more because we have so many interesting things to say. So, but I give the floor to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear participants, Excellencies, thank you very much for being with us today. First of all, before I begin this session, I would like to say a few words of introduction on behalf of the steering committee to welcome you here first. Switzerland is part of the steering committee with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Sweden, the government of France, the Philippines, and China. And it is of utmost importance for me to take this opportunity to thank the organizers. Sorry, and Indonesia. Oh, sorry, did I miss Indonesia? Sorry for that, Habib. I would like to thank the organizers, the ASEM, for the tremendous work that has been done for the organization of this seminar. I also would like to express my gratitude to the government of Luxembourg for this generous welcome and perfect hosting of this event. As you know, Switzerland attached the greatest importance to the human rights and to the question of environment. Switzerland is part of the of the core group, which has presented this new resolution at the Human Rights Council last October on the right to the safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment, which was a real success. And we are extremely interested now about this discussion, which contribute to not only to the understanding of the problematic, but also to define together what are the steps forward on this extremely topical issue. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the next part of the discussion. We have the pleasure today to listen to the rapporteurs of the different working groups. The first working group is going to be reported by Mr. Sébastien Douillec. Mr. Douillec is a senior attorney for the Center for International Environmental Law in the Climate and Energy Program. He's the campaign manager for the Human Rights and Climate Change portfolio. Mr. Douillec's work focuses primarily on promoting the integration of human rights and public participation in climate governance and in strengthening accountability for climate harm. So thank you very much for being with us today. We're looking forward to listen to you.
Should I present?
You want to present here
Okay.
as you want.
So, good morning, everyone. I will have a very challenging task of trying to summarize 3.5 hours of very rich conversation yesterday from very different experts and stakeholders with very rich diversity of background. So, I will ask for your patience and understanding with me and invite my fellow participants to really come in during the question and answer session if I forgot anything. And I would like to start by really thanking all of the participants, the organizers, for organizing an in-person session actually in early 2002 to discuss those very important and timely issues. The authors of the paper, the background paper, and the chair of the session yesterday, who really demonstrated actually how to support a rich conversation in a hybrid format. So thank you, Dr. Islam, for the moderation of the session yesterday. And most of all, actually, I wanted to just thank you all for the very rich conversation we had here over the last two days. As we've just heard, it has been a very important time in the history of human rights and climate change integration. And so it's been great to benefit from the discussion, but also from the inspiration that the work of many of you have provided me in previous work. Now I will be reporting back on the discussion yesterday. If we could see the first, to start and focus on the theme, yesterday in Working Group 1, we discussed the importance of reinforcing socio-ecological resilience for information and public participation. And as you may know, the IPCC itself is recognizing that actually civil society is the only driver that can actually force institutions to change at the pace that is required to face the climate crisis. So a very interesting theme indeed. If we move to slide number 1, I will have 3 slides summarizing some of the key messages.
I think you have the...
Oh, sorry, yes, that's even better. Do you know in which direction should I point?
Here.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, excellent, sorry. Thank you so much. The first, I'm sorry if it's, the script is small, but let me go through the statements. I try to summarize some of the key talking points really in statements so that they can hopefully resonate with you as you go back to your administrations, institutions, organizations, and universities. The first point that was stressed yesterday is the importance of really moving towards or ensuring meaningful and effective participation in climate-related decision-making. And we started by discussing the importance of having actual standards that are respected to ensure meaningful participation, with a focus on elements such as the importance of information being provided, adequate timeline for input, languages being used that are adequate for the public. We also spoke about the importance of international instruments. The Aarhus Convention was mentioned in the presentation of the background paper and the value that it provided to the European and Central Asian countries, and the importance perhaps for other countries to also consider either joining, acceding to the Aarhus Convention or developing a similar instrument in the Asian region. And we stress the importance of ensuring meaningful participation in ways that really enable civil society input to be taken into consideration effectively in the context of each decision-making processes and the challenges of achieving this, given the very different nature of different processes. We also discussed a lot the importance to move beyond tokenism, something that a lot of civil society participants in the room yesterday stressed when public participation is not actually effective and doesn't really empower civil society. In this context, we discussed the importance of ensuring that participation in decision-making is not symbolic, but really meaningful, and actually is not serving only to tick boxes or validate a process, but intervenes at a time when options are still open. We discussed the importance of ensuring accountability of civil servants and decision makers involved in those processes to build confidence among civil society that actually their input was adequately taken into consideration and to document the actual impact that civil society and public input had on decision making. And one of the examples that was provided of such accountability mechanism is, for instance, community or youth-led budget monitoring that really enables an actual, very practical, that can serve as an actual and practical mechanism to ensure accountability. A point that was mentioned time and again yesterday in relation to different guiding questions was the importance not to cherry pick who are the actors participating in decision making, but really to work with and to strengthen existing civil society structure so that they can really play a key role in building socio-ecological resilience. In particular, to rely on the structures of civil society that already exist, that are independent, that really represent the voices of different constituencies, and the importance of providing adequate resources, because participation in governance takes time, takes resources, takes capacity. So an invitation for governments, both domestically and through international assistance, to really strengthen civil society. As ASEF reflects very well, we also stress the importance of cross-national, cross-regional cooperation among civil society networks, and again, there are opportunities to further support this sharing of experiences across countries and regions. And one point that was made several times also is the importance of capacity building, but not only for civil society, for youth actors, but also capacity building and training for decision makers to understand how actually to take into account effectively civil society, how to take into account the different social, cultural differences that actually really are informing the way in which decision makers should engage with different members of the local communities. And then leading to this question, we next discussed a lot and insisted on the importance, of course, of taking an intersectional approach. The importance of gender was something that I think all working groups hopefully discuss, but in our working group on participation, we stress the importance of taking a gender lens. And in the recommendation that we'll provide to the report of the workshop, we'll have much more detailed suggestions on what these imply, respect for the rights of indigenous people, and also the importance of focusing on children and youth. As a prerequisite to achieve this, some of the participants stressed that actually the first thing that really needs to be at the core of these intersectional approaches is the recognition by decision makers of the actual value of women knowledge, of traditional knowledge, to really take seriously the input that will be provided, and to give confidence to those actors that indeed their participation is going to be genuine and meaningful. We also described what a comprehensive gender lens could imply, taking into consideration how public participation interact with family work or care work that is traditionally still delivered primarily by women, how to ensure that this doesn't create a burden on top of all other commitments, but how do we also ensure that they are perhaps women-focused groups that enable women to speak more openly when the cultural context makes other mixed groups a little bit more difficult. And we stressed a lot the importance of bottom-up participation, the importance of investing and recognizing community and youth-led initiatives. Again, there will be more specific examples in the report, but we spoke about the importance of actually using the channels that already exist and that are youth-compatible or youth-focused to really deliver, for instance, messages to communities on the ground. The importance for, in some communities, perhaps to use drama, to rely on independent journalists, to really reach out to those communities where they are, and then enable their input. And also the importance of actual youth-led and youth-focused initiatives and structure was mentioned several times, including, for instance, independent national youth councils that channel input towards the national government, programs of youth delegates going, for instance, to the UN climate conferences, and other such initiatives that really enable a genuine participation by young people. Finally, we discussed new technologies, and clearly this meeting and the participant online who contributed effectively yesterday highlights that there are opportunities with new technologies, particularly in a post-COVID era, but also that there are clear limits in relation to it. And so we discussed some of the limits, including the importance of addressing the digital divide. Never to forget that there are connectivity issues that remain, that the quality of internet is not the same everywhere, but also that there are big gaps in internet literacy that need to be addressed, and we cannot just take for granted that the internet and new technologies will help us in the context of public participation without accompanying measures. And perhaps leading to the final point, one thing that was made clear yesterday is for technology to play a role in empowering public participation, we need to recognize and address the specific security and privacy issues that come with the use of internet. And this is a point that was made yesterday because we also discussed then something that I would like to conclude, but that a lot of participants actually stressed yesterday, is an imperative for both regions, and it was really clearly discussed yesterday as something that should be of higher concern for both European and Asian governments. It is the effective protection of environmental human rights defenders, in particular indigenous and women environmental defenders, because we cannot ask communities to participate in decision-making if they see that their peers who engage in decision-making are being the targets afterwards of reprisals. A few points were made in relation to this, in particular the fact that unfortunately the evidence demonstrates that corporate actors are often driving those reprisals against environmental human rights defenders, and in that context states must uphold their duty to protect defenders against violation of their rights by private actors. There was a discussion of the importance of regional protection mechanisms and other forms of international cooperation to support environmental human rights defenders, and in particular we discussed and celebrated yesterday the establishment of a rapid response mechanism for the protection of environmental defenders under the Aarhus Convention, something that was decided just last year and is supposed to be operational in the coming months. And there was also two important points made that will bring us back to the beginning of this presentation, is the fact that if we want to take the threats and the protection of environmental human rights defenders seriously, we need to recognize that it is actually the climate of impunity, the lack of accountability, the lack of respect for civil society that actually acts as a fertile ground for threats to human rights defenders. And so if we want to protect them, this should be the starting point, respecting the civil society space. And finally, for civil society to really be able to provide support to environmental human rights defenders, we need to strengthen their institutions, to invest again, including financially, in civil society structure, to really enable them to better protect defenders. I'm sure there are so many things that I've left out, but I will really look forward to participants who engaged in this discussion of more than 3 hours yesterday to complement during the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duick. I will not open the floor now to questions or to comments. We will come back to that in the end of the presentations. Next, I would like to present somebody who doesn't need to be presented anymore, but let me say a few words on Professor Joly, who has accepted to the report on the Working Group 2. So Dr. Selina Joly is a senior assistant professor at the Faculty of Legal Studies, South Asian University. She's a visiting senior research associate with the Center for Emerging Countries in Private International Law at the University of Johannesburg. Her research work is specialized on, she has explored the North-South dimensions relations on climate change. Recent research also focused on the emerging global trends of rights of nature. So thank you very much, Professor Joly, for being with us today again online. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, good morning to all of you. So I'll be presenting the report of the working group on promoting the full enjoyment of human rights by all persons affected by climate change. First of all, as Sebastian pointed out, I think it's a Herculean task to, encapsulate the entire discussions which happened for 3.5 hours and 10 minutes. But I think I'll try my level best to see how far I was able to cover the points. And during the question and answer sessions, I will request if I have missed out or if I have not taken into account what they have intended to say in the correct direction. So please feel free to correct me. So I'll start with thanking the moderator of the session, Dr. Sabine Perry, who not only conducted the session in an engaging manner, but also provided me the valuable inputs as part of the preparation of this particular report. I also thank all the participants of the working group from academia, government sector, and civil society for not only sharing their experience, expertise, and also providing a kind of a roadmap or a key findings which could be useful as part of the final report and also to disseminate among the countries. I also thank the note makers of the session, Tristan and Jeff, for providing, just immediately after the workshop, they mailed me the notes. So many thanks to that. So as we can see, the focus of the working group was on promoting the full enjoyment. I think the last 2 days of workshop, almost all the experts had agreed the kind of climate change and disproportionate impact based on multiple vulnerability, including, you can see, the environmental right defenders, indigenous population, and gender. So the working group essentially focused on how to ensure these vulnerable populations to see that their enjoyment or attainment of human rights is not curtailed or affected by climate change. Based on the background paper and also the concept note, Dr. Sabine and I had decided that there are certain cross-cutting themes, and also for this particular working group, there were around 7 discussion points. So for the sake of convenience, we have tried to arrange these 7, the main discussion point, into 3 blocks and try to arrange the discussions accordingly. And among all these 3 blocks, we try to look into 3 aspects of that issue. One, first trying to identify the existing maybe policy or the gaps which is their implementation gap. And second, in terms of trying to evaluate and explore the best practices or the initiatives which is taking place, which could be perhaps replicated or scaled up across. And lastly, coming out with certain key findings or suggestions to take it forward. So as part of the discussion, the first point of our discussion was on climate migrations and whether the international initiative like Nansen initiative can be revitalized. So if I look into the discussions, I think most of the participants did identify certain challenges, especially in terms of trying to find out whether it is an internal displacement or an external displacement, the problems of a permanent relocation, and to the challenges of finding that in an atmosphere where the human rights are accessible. It's also important that along with the lack of policy measures, as environmental issues are not merely per se environmental, it's connected entirely at, very intricately attached to various socio-cultural aspects. So the migration or the displacement aspect and the connection between trafficking was also highlighted. They have also highlighted the need to look at the internal or external migrations with a different lens and different legal strategies and the mode of coordination. As far as the best practices concerned, yes, the participants did highlight the resilience which is exhibited by countries like India, Philippines, Bangladesh through capacity building, the good governance structure, or maybe through the legal policies, how they have over the years tried to face various disasters and the challenges of displacement. Regional mobility framework operating in the Pacific was highlighted. And this is, I think, very important considering the fact that the climate displacement initially from an internal, it could be more than the international element, it could be regional in nature. So I think a regional framework or outlook could be important. And what is operating in the Pacific was highlighted. Another aspect among the best practices, it was also stressed by many of the participants, was that when you're looking for a solution, there is a tendency to look for a simple solutions, but I think more research is required. So this particular discussion has taken place in the context of land sparing, and what could be its, this may appear to be a appealing solutions to many, but it has got many consequences in terms of its effect on indigenous community or biodiversity protection. So any kind of a solution, I think, has to be based on the interdisciplinary research and a very sound basis, and also the participatory approach. As far as the kind of a findings or recommendations to this issue is concerned, various the suggestions ranging from looking at and linking it with the concept of loss and damage, and also bringing in the global compact, which looks at averting and reducing the disaster risk or the threat to displacement. And the mobility framework at the regional level was definitely emphasized, and supporting of national legislation and policy framework. But I think in all the questions, one thing which comes out very, very clearly is the need of perspective, the perspective of even the displaced population. There is a need of changing in the perceptions, and also trying to find out the root causes. Like the participants also has stressed that the root cause of climate change or other environmental degradation lies definitely in the kind of an economical system. So that has to be changed. And they also stressed on the need for more research for even finding out any solutions. The next discussion point was on the indigenous communities, which Sebastian also highlighted. Our focus of the discussion was to see that how they could be, their traditional knowledge could be utilized, and how they can be vital agents in terms of the climate response. So almost all the participants were in agreement that yes, indigenous communities are affected by the climate change. But what I want to highlight here is the best practices which came out of the discussion, at least, which could be replicated. The Finland's example, which is highlighted, their active consultation or a participatory mode of governance with the Sami, one of the indigenous population of Finland. There also the proposed climate council. Pertinently, this idea of the climate council came from the community members itself, so which consists of the climate experts and also the indigenous research, the experts who researches in the indigenous or indigenous members. So this is a platform to share their traditional knowledge and their knowledge in terms of the climate action. So, so this is something I think maybe not in this particular manner. So at least as a participatory approach, this is something which can be replicated if one, any policy measures has to be taken in the context of an indigenous population. The best practices also highlighted various national legislations, which is there in order to protect the indigenous communities, also including certain judicial statements. For instance, the Supreme Court of the Philippines recognized the indigenous people's rights of natural resources. Indonesia's, the categorization of forest, including the indigenous forest. But having said that, all the participants also stressed on the important, because given the history of abuses, especially in terms of the land relationship, the trust building with the community is definitely highlighted, and their participation. So, and also the capacity building in terms of access to various legal instruments, and also the monitoring of the indigenous projects or other this thing based on indicators. The trust building and participation was definitely one of the key points which is emphasized as part of this particular discussion. The next discussion point was again as highlighted by the Sebastian on the environmental human rights defenders. And the participants agreed that many parts of the world, the challenges faced by the human rights and environmental rights defenders. But the good aspect of the discussion was that we were able to highlight certain best practices which has developed across the jurisdictions, with the various institutional response mechanism, the national human rights institutions operating. For instance, India has a focal point for the environmental right defenders. There is in the Southeast Asian jurisdictions, there is capacity building program for the judicial officers, and Asia Pacific network of environmental defenders, and UNEP policy on environmental defenders. No, there should be, and it was highlighted that the UNEP, the guidelines, there has to be a more dissemination and the coordination, or a kind of a networking and solidarity which can be developed, which can promote much more awareness, and among, not only among the civil society, but also among the governments and also the judicial officers. So one of the Italian practices which was highlighted, which is also, I think it's very, very pertinent in the preparation of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, the coordination initiative include members of the civil society and ERT. I think so. These are a couple of the best practices which can be taken forward and replicated, and especially I think UNEP's policy can get much more dissemination and among the various stakeholders and also among the jurisdictions. The next point, discussion point, was it included 4 questions, but we have clubbed it under one heading because this is talking about various markers of vulnerability in terms of gender, differently abled, LGBTQ, young and older persons. And this is a fact, I think almost all the experts in the last 2 days were again and again reiterating the disproportionate impact. So this is a point which was accepted, acknowledged by all the participants, the vulnerability. But again, I would want to highlight the best practices which we were able to locate. The Finland again has very interesting councils based on various vulnerability markers for the elders, the younger people, and with the disabilities. And even Italy has a very, very robust method of engagement with the youth representatives. Italy co-hosted an event for the youth climate just prior to the COP26. So these are all, I think, very important initiatives which is taking place. And yes, gender impact assessment for climate policies in Finland is, I think, one mechanism which can be replicated with adequate capacity building or assistance among the different jurisdictions. Similar also is the development of the Sign Language Act, which is passed in Finland, one of the, I think, very innovative method, very relevant in the context of indigenous people and also differently abled populations. The participants also highlighted the use of social media in order to create the awareness, and also that's the solidarity and cooperations, because this is an age, I think, we can build up the transnational solidarity and highlight a certain event. So these vulnerabilities has to be highlighted. I think social media can be a powerful, and climate change in all levels of educational aspect was highlighted. Similar is the inclusion of a human rights approach. And I think that is the focus of this particular workshop itself. So in order to overcome all this vulnerability, I think human rights approach could be one of that, along with other approaches. But in all this aspect, role of civil society and the community perspective is very, very important. So these are a couple of aspects which was highlighted in during the discussions. But if I have to really summarize, I think maybe 2 or 3 points, I will say one is on the participation and local level of governance. Second is on the need of a more research, and especially the interdisciplinary research. And the third is on cooperation and coordination, not just between governments, on a multi-layer, including different multiple stakeholders. So this is what, in a nutshell, what we discussed. I hope I am able to include at least most of the points, but if I missed out anything, please, I'll be very, very happy to note that, and will be incorporating in the presentation and the preparation of the report later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joly, for this very good summary of our discussion. I was also part of working group 2, so I think you very well summarized the in-depth of our discussion. Now I would like to invite Dr. Linda Yanti Suli Stiavati, who is also online, who is going to report from the working group 3. Yes, so before we see Dr. Stiavati, I would like to say a few words on her. She's a senior research fellow at the Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law at the National University of Singapore, and also an associate professor of law in universities Gajah Mada in Indonesia. She's an internationally recognized scholar in Indonesia, and her research on international environmental issues has established her as a leading expert who is frequently consulted by the Indonesian government and international organizations. Thank you very much, Dr. Suli Stiavati, to be with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the organizer to finally able to bring us all together, whether it is online or in person. Of course, I envy all of you who are there in person. You get to do the field trips, etc. That sounds like really, really fun. But on behalf of Working Group 3, yesterday, I'm tasked to yesterday's discussion. I'm tasked to make a summary of what we have discussed, as you have seen on the screen. And this is not just myself, but also with Professor Robert Hansen. Robert have already led us through the 3.5 hours of discussion. And then I also have 2 other people who hold my hands in making notes, Anika and John from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Luxembourg. Thank you so much to, be very swiftly in sending me all their notes. Okay, I don't know how to click this. Okay, thank you. So during the 3.5 hours yesterday, we had 2 sessions. And during the 2 sessions, we spoke about 4 big topics. We understood that there were guiding questions in the big document, but also we want all of our participants in the Working Group 3 to discuss what they think is their priorities in terms of the topic, right? The first topic here is just transition. And our participants, which ranges, I think, very nicely. We have a representative from youth organization. We have a representative from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, other governmental offices also were there, and their international organization. And then we have NHRI's representatives. We have lawyers, we have professors, and we even have PhD students who are writing on the topic, participating in the discussion. So it was a very rich discussion. And the first topic was, to start off, we discussed what just transition means to all the participants. So we need to know whether our understanding of just transition is, aligned with each other. And then we came up with these 3 main statements. I would say key messages. The first one is that just transition might be viewed differently by different actors. International government, national government, or local government and business sector might have viewed this just transition as financial support to alleviate poverty, while vulnerable groups impacted by climate change would view just transition as a tool to support their human rights whilst dealing with climate impacts. And then the second statement is that transformation towards green economy leads to just transition, so that the green development pathways will help countries, specifically developing countries, to disengage from their dependent of fossil fuel-based economy. this green transition movement should include human rights approaches in dealing with climate impacts. And then the third statement is that support from developed countries toward developing countries are needed in green economy and just transition. Financial assistance, capacity building, technology transfer, useful tools, networking, and communication of best practices and methods are types of supports needed to achieve just transition. And then the second topic is the mechanism to integrate human rights issues in climate change regime. So we all agree that the current international mechanism for climate change are not yet adequate to facilitate the inclusion of human rights issues into the regime. More robust, inclusive, and yet detailed mechanism is needed to integrate human rights issues in the climate regime. Regional efforts have been done or currently in progress to integrate human rights issues in the climate regime. The second statement for this second topic is that business sector needed to be included in this global and regional mechanism. Globally, the UN has launched the UNGPBHR, United Nations Guideline for Business and Human Rights, to reaffirm business sector's responsibility on climate impacts. And regionally, there are already EU-ASEAN discussion on National Action Plan on BHR, and upcoming EU directive on due diligence are among the examples of the efforts. And then we all agree that hard and soft laws are needed for this endeavor. Legally binding instrument would push this agenda further, but however, soft laws such as national action plans and other national and regional commitments are also important for countries to foster interests, momentum, and political will to further human rights issues in climate regime. And then our fourth statement is that International Green Court, we had like quite fruitful discussion on this International Green Court, that it is a good idea to equalize the position of less powerful countries against giant corporations, which might be more powerful than the countries. But we also acknowledge that there are already national environmental courts and tribunals, which are also venues to seek justice of human rights issues in climate impacts. Next. Okay. And then our third topic is on NHRI, National Human Rights Institute. So the roles of NHRI are important to highlight the nexus between human rights and climate impacts. NHRI can operate outside the jurisdiction of states, empowered by its internal mechanism, due process of law, fairness, and orderly, and supporting the roles of the states. Learning from the Philippines NHRI's experience, the future of NHRI needs to combine efforts and networking to reach greater resonance. However, the level and capacity and mandate of NHRIs differs. Support and assistance are needed to empower NHRIs, specifically NHRI in developing countries, but also there are NHRIs in developed countries that also need empowerment. And then our last topic is human rights in climate emergency as priority, because we understood that the current situation, like COVID, like the security problem in Europe, has put, our priority in terms of human rights and climate emergency, into probably the second page or third page, or we don't know what. So we want to have human rights in climate emergency to still be a priority, if we can, a number one priority. So the divergence between Europe and Asia, we think, can be tackled with a holistic approach in human rights and climate impacts, nurturing big alliances, international assistance, while taking into account traditional and local wisdom in terms of energy consumption and climate issues. And then why we need to put human rights and climate emergency as a priority, we will have to foster political will, and we need to do rapid green transition urgently. COVID-19 has given us lesson learned on being less consumptive and valuing green issues with our current limited resources. I think that's what we discussed yesterday in the working group. Of course, we discussed a lot of more things, and I would like to invite our fellow working group participants to be active, to give us inputs and their comments during the discussion session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sulistiavati. Very in-depth presentation. I would like now to invite Dr. Annalisa Savarese to come here on the floor. She's here. Once again, I think we almost do not need to present you anymore. You are the author of this very useful background paper that has given us the capacity to discuss in a very concrete manner this topic, climate change, human rights and climate change. Dr. Savarese you're an expert in environmental law and on the interplay between human rights and environmental law. You have produced numerous publications on climate change, emissions from land uses and right-based approach to environment and law policy. You're also associate editor of the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law, and currently serve as director for Europe for the Global Network on Human Rights and the Environment. Thank you very much for being with us and for all the work, preparatory work that you've done for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and indeed thank you for having me again on this podium to explain what was discussed in Working Group 4. The working group was led by Kalino Baez from the Philippines Human Rights Commission, whom I thank very much for her leadership in leading this discussion that was very rich and active. There were some overlaps between Working Group 4 and the other working groups that have already been presented, so I will try and focus on the distinguishing aspects of our conversation. The first question that Working Group 4 was asked to look at was that of climate legislation and the extent to which it incorporates rights-based approaches. There was some discussion if any best practices exist on this. Some reference was made, for example, to the Climate Change Act of the Philippines, of the Bangladesh very recent Climate Prosperity Plan. And we concluded that there was need to share knowledge on this more intensively between ASEM countries. In this connection, there was also reference to the useful work that David Boyd has already made in highlighting best practices on human rights and environment, and some of this includes climate law and policy making. So there was a reference to the need to consolidate our knowledge and to understand what lessons are there already to be learned. There was a question for us to address concerning the role of national human rights institutions that was already addressed by the previous speaker. What we said was that NHRIs are a natural first port of call to consider, on the one hand, the impacts of climate change on the enjoyment of human rights, but on the other also the impacts of climate change response measures on the enjoyment of human rights. So there is a need to bolster the capacity of these institutions to deal with these matters, because it's a veritable landslide of issues that is landing before national human rights institutions. So there's a need to create capacity within these institutions and to enable them to share knowledge with one another on how to deal with these issues. And we've heard about important initiatives that are already happening in Southeast Asia in order to enable dialogue between national human rights institutions in the region. And in general, I need to share lessons. We, with Sebastien, were involved in some capacity building initiatives that took place under the auspices of Gandhi on the sidelines of COP26, but there is need for more of this kind of activities going forward. The working group also tackled the question of the right to a healthy environment, its specific role in climate governance. There was a rich discussion on this. We acknowledge that there is an ongoing movement for the recognition of the right to a healthy environment in the UN, and that this, of course, is not only about climate and goes well beyond the conversation that we are having here today. What was said in this regard is that there is clearly a lot of practice concerning the implementation and the recognition of this right at the national and the regional level, and that this practice needs to be translated and applied in the climate context. Some of this is already happening, much more needs to happen going forward, so as to mainstream really the protection of the right to a healthy environment in climate action and in decision and policy making on climate change. We then discussed another big theme, which is that of climate litigation, that was touched upon also in other working groups. We acknowledge that climate litigation that relies on human rights is on the rise, both in Asia and in Europe. Some milestones have been achieved and have informed lawmaking, especially in Europe, but not only. We recognize that the influence of these processes is context-specific. The famous Urgenda, for example, has affected lawmaking in the Netherlands. No buyer has affected lawmaking in Germany. But we need to really distill bigger lessons for others. And there is a lot of work being done in order to understand what lessons can be learned from these key milestones for others to do better climate legislation that aligns with human rights. And in this regard, there is a need also to focus our minds on the role of litigation in addressing the impacts of climate change and the victims of climate change. We spoke about the National Human Rights Institution of the Philippines and the inquiry we conducted on the carbon mayors and all the complexities associated with this type of work for a national human rights institution. So there was in general acknowledgement that there is a lot that is still to be explored about the value of litigation and indeed about the role of litigation in addressing specific human rights concerns. We talked about the rights of future generations next, and we acknowledge that this is an area where there is limited practice. But there is a lot of new initiatives underway. For example, we mentioned efforts to involve the youth in decision-making processes concerning climate action and how these initiatives need to be showcased, discussed, and shared with others so that there is a more mainstream approach to involving the youth in decision-making over climate, because they are the ones who will bear the brunt of all decisions that are taken today. And they need to provide greater opportunities for youth delegates to access international and regional gatherings concerning climate action, but this was already discussed in a previous report. Finally, we had a bit of fun talking about the priorities of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change. We're all expecting the nomination to happen any day now, and we engage in a foresight exercise, identifying the topics that we think this new rapporteur should be dealing with. A lot of work has already been done, and this is acknowledged in the paper that I prepared for this seminar. At the same time, we acknowledge there's loads that needs to be done still. And in particular, we highlighted the role of the rapporteur in identifying and refining our understanding of human rights obligations vis-à-vis the crucial matter of loss and damage. that is inadequately addressed by international climate treaties. The role of human rights obligations in bolstering action concerning climate finance and really explaining what states' obligations are in this connection under human rights law. Of course, there is the ever-present matter of climate migrants and how to address this issue from a human rights perspective. We talked also about technology transfer and state obligations in this regard from a human rights perspective, the role of climate change defenders, or climate defenders more appropriately possibly. We spoke about the impact of climate change response measures, especially in land uses and access to energy by poorer segments of the population. We spoke about the role of human rights obligations in the context of NDCs, national determined contributions, those plans that periodically parties to the climate treaties have to present to the UNFCCC treaty bodies and the Paris Agreement treaty bodies. And finally, we talked about the role of human rights law in defining corporate responsibilities vis-à-vis climate change. So there is a lot for the US Special Rapporteur to do. We gave him a hard task already even before his or her appointment. But it was definitely a stimulating conversation, and I thank everybody who contributed to that. And of course, very happy to take any questions and for any inputs from the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we can go to some to some discussion. I would like to invite the participants to perhaps comment or complete what has been said by the four rapporteurs. Just a few rules, so those who are following us online can ask their questions. I will get them here on my board and read them. For those who are here with us, there are 2 microphones on each side, so you are invited to stand up and go and ask your question directly or make your comments on the different presentations. So. Is there any willingness from the participant to comment already what have been said, or any question to be asked at that point? So I let you think about the questions and comments. Perhaps just one question on my side is that we are here, the ASEM Human Rights Seminar. We have seen a lot of different recommendations that has been identified. What I hear is the necessity to include the communities, to include also the business, corporate enterprise in this discussion, but also the national institutions. My question would be, okay, as ASEM Human Rights Seminars and the steering committee, what would be the next step for us? How could we contribute to the capacity building of decision makers, for example? That could be one group on which we could focus. Or where do you see our added value further to this 3 days discussion that we had today? Could we make sure that the work we have done here can be further used for promotion of this very topical issue? So. Is there any of you would like to answer also online? Yes, Mr. Duke?
So this theme of cooperation really came up in the conversations that we had. So maybe just two key responses to this. The first one is the importance to strengthen structures, both civil society, including civil society network, that facilitate dialogue and the sharing of practices and experience between Europe and Asia, but also the institutions. We mentioned a lot national human rights institutions. We could have spoken also about the strengthening of gender machineries and other forms of institutions that exist to really promote the dimensions that we've discussed today. Climate councils and other mechanisms for participation. So there is an opportunity to exchange information on the good practices and also strengthen with resources those institutions. And maybe just an additional point is also that the Asian-Europe focus of ASEM perhaps could really enable ASEM to also help its participating states and institutions to really consider extraterritorial dimensions, how to regulate business actors that have an extraterritorial impact, for instance, in the context of defenders.
Yes. Thank you very much. Any comment you want to comment or online? Please raise your hand if you want to comment, because I cannot see if you would like to take the floor. So, Anna.
Yes, in addition to what Seb just said, I would add that there is a lot of need to share knowledge across the regions. All countries in the world have developed their NDCs. They are now in the process of implementing the actions that they have planned. And in this regard, we are witnessing a parallel process of lawmaking and implementation, and everybody's learning by doing. In this regard, the role of human rights has not been at the forefront of the actors involved in these plans and in their implementation. Some countries have led the way, and it's very important that the countries that have done this really try and share what lessons they have learned. And in the detail, there is initiatives like the ones that are mentioned in the paper and that were also discussed in the working group that really need to be studied closely in order to understand the possibilities that are there in order to mainstream a human rights-based approach to climate action.
Thank you. Dr. Sulistyawati.
Thank you. Just call me Linda, it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, my name is kind of long, even for me. So I think I would like to echo like both rapporteurs there. I think our working group also discussed this, like, so what's next? I think the organization like ASEM is a good nexus to bridge between governments, between, stakeholders in human rights and in climate change, even youth organization, indigenous people, and NGO, in terms of communication, in terms of spreading information, even like in more tangible things that are needed, by NHRI or by youth organizations, or even some developing countries would still need, like trainings, networking, technology transfers, idea transfers, and also in our working group yesterday, we also, even though like Europe is like the center of knowledge and information, we should not disregard the local wisdom and traditional knowledge that is already there in Asia or other developing countries that there are in Europe. So I guess this flexibility is not inherent, in just any organization. I think this organization is good. Like this institution could take it further in terms of the neutrality and in terms of the way you can pull people and stakeholders together.
Thank you very much. I don't see if Stelina Jolie would like to add also a comment on this point.
Initially, I was not knowing how to raise I could not locate that option. Thank you. I just want to supplement all the other panelists, and I completely agree with whatever I said. But in addition to that, I will emphasize on information and public education. When I say information relating to whether it is a climate finance or a climate response or a human rights, these impacts, I think, percolating at the very, very grassroots level. And also the education and information sharing in the context of local administration. See, I'll just give you an example. See, it's not always necessary to have a climate specific legislation. Maybe it is quite possible that existing legislations can be leveraged and they have enough hooks. For instance, if I take an example from India, we don't have any enabling climate legislations, but if I look at in the forest sector, yes, the climate aspects of bread or other protective mechanism can be incorporated. So I think the local level where the vulnerable communities and the local administration, there is a need of tremendous information dissemination and also the capacity building to start from at that, because that's the, I think, place where we can even bring about the perspective and lived experiences. And maybe the international civil societies and organizations also may have a much bigger role to play in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see some question coming in and leaving here on my board. So before I realize I get to understand how it works, I suggest to give the word. Sabine, do you have questions or comments?
Yeah, it was. Thank you very much, Jenny. I was just wanted to highlight a nuance that I thought was very important in our group. And thank you, Stelina, for a really comprehensive summary that you have given us earlier. It was about building the resilience and capacity building in the context of human rights and environmental defenders. And what I thought was really a valuable point is that obviously, yes, capacity building is needed, but sometimes it seems to be an overemphasis on capacity building and an underemphasis on taking up what's already there, because people have a lot of capacities and there is a lot of knowledge and a lot of competence of how to deal with these questions. And sometimes I think we tend to forget about really, these local resources and take them up. So I just wanted to emphasize that nuance that I thought was a good contribution in our working group. And actually, I also liked the emphasis of working group number 1, which was capacity building for the decision makers to actually be able to also see those local resources and channel them in a positive and powerful way. And I was going to frame that also against the background that we also talk about internationally a shrinking space for civil society. And I do think we need to also frame our recommendations against that, which is empirically quite obvious. So I think we should be aware of that. And then, since you gave me the mic, sorry, I'll abuse it to throw in a second thought, which is the one on just transition. I think it's hugely important to talk about our understanding of just transition. In a discussion I recently had with one of the heads of our state secretariat for economy on the international section, when I brought in this idea of just transition and equality, he was kind of outraged because he said, well, that's what Saudi Arabia says when they don't want to go away from fossil fuels because they want to have affordable energy for everyone. So I was a bit exposed there. And of course, every good concept, every good idea can be abused. But I do think we need to think about what understanding do we put forward and how can we confront these discussions, which can be very counterproductive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Any of you would like to react, or should I perhaps, before I ask the other questions? I see Sabine. No? Okay, so I have 3 questions here. Perhaps let me ask the 2 first one. First one, is there any one window shop or database of NGOs working on human rights and climate change issues? Certainly interesting to know your answer on that. It's a very technical one. And the second question is, are there any option with United Nations to enter into a legal document like UNCRC and UNCDWA? I'm not sure, perhaps the precision of the CEWA, do you know that? I'm not an expert, sorry for that. Sebastian, do you want to react on that?
So very briefly, on the one-stop shop access, where you could find a database of all of those organizations, I'm afraid it doesn't exist. At least I'm not aware of it. And I've worked in this space for a long time. I wish there was one. And maybe that's homework that we can do with partners if anyone is interested. There are different networks that work on this, but also engaging at different level of governance. But that seems an incredibly interesting idea because we need to like the first part of building a network is actually to identify who are the key stakeholders that are already engaged or that would like to become engaged. So definitely a great idea. The CRC and CEDAW, it's probably the Convention on the Rights of a Child and the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that are two of the UN human rights instruments. Both of them have done incredible work actually on addressing the human rights dimensions, the climate change dimension of the human rights obligation of the states under both of those instruments, as have actually other human rights instruments done. This is partly documented in Annalisa's paper, but this is definitely one place where civil society can come to the United Nations with input, in particular with country-specific input, to trigger actually some questions, some recommendations from UN bodies. So from the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, to guide governments in implementing their existing human rights obligation in the context of climate change. And really what's important there, just to finish with this, is that always the focus is on existing obligations and just how do we interpret them in the context of climate change. So a lot of great work ongoing, but really useful entry point for states and civil society to engage with an UN expert body.
Yes. Thank you. So a very good way to enter and to engage inclusion with what we heard from the working group, the necessity to include the communities and the person which are the most affected by climate change. Anybody else would like to react on these 2 points? No? Other questions from the floor here? No. Yes.
Perhaps I can pick up on the point that was raised concerning just transition. Indeed, whenever an idea starts floating around, especially diplomatic circles, they need to be filled in with content. And I do think that this is an area that we discussed briefly in WG4, where some guidance from, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur would be helpful. ILO has already provided guidelines on just transition. They were departing very much from the context of workers' and laborers' rights. But clearly this concept has come to capture many more things than just workers' rights. And it would really be interesting if there was some guidance from a human rights perspective what this actually means in practice. There is lots of tensions that we have mentioned over the last couple of days between, you know, a series of climate change response measures and the protection of human rights that need to be addressed by means of a just transition. And the European Union has already developed some ideas. The challenge, I think, is to test these concepts, this guidance coming from the EU, from a human rights perspective, and see what works and what doesn't, and why, and really collectively learn from this experience.
I think it goes back to what we discussed in working group 2, the need of research, and this question of just transition, like we are all talking about it from several years, but I think definitely need to go in a little bit more in depth on this subject of just transition. What do you mean by that? What are the challenges also linked to this? Thank you very much. I have one more question online, but anybody here would like to ask a question? Yes.
Hi. Is this on?
Yeah,
yes.
It's on. Thank you.
So Matthew Scott from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. I think it's some reflections that might stimulate more discussion, and forgive me if they're not well formulated. There's many aspects of the discussion that we've had across the different panels and across the many days. And one of the questions that I walk away from the session and the seminar with is the one about political will. And this is something where we have a lot of material, a lot of knowledge, a lot of standards and guidelines from the local level up to the international level. It's pretty well articulated across a lot of these platforms what states' human rights obligations are in this regard. And as we heard from Sebastian earlier, it's it's well developed already. So it's a question of maybe a bit of interpretation from the Committee on the Rights of the Child or the CEDAW committee, how this applies in the context of climate change. But we already have the great work of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, who talks about what is a right to a healthy environment. It's clean air, it's clean water, it's sustainable food, and these kind of points. But the question that I've got, maybe for the next climate Special Rapporteur on climate change, is how can you leverage human rights standards, and maybe the point that Sebastian made earlier about the role of civil society here is key. How do you leverage this human rights movement to get the transformative agenda moving as fast as it needs to move? Because the framework is there, the principles are there, but the movement is too slow. So how do we get that process going faster as it needs to?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I also asked the question that I received from the online. In some parts of the world, underdevelopment may be the cause of insufficient protection of human rights related to climate change. What suggestion do you have to better balance the need to development and the concern on protection of human rights? I think it's another perspective on this topic, but I suggest that we answer the question. I see that somebody else is interested in asking a question. Let's take the three of them, and then we can answer them together.
Yes, hello, my name is Birgit Engel, working for a Luxembourg-based NGO called ASEM. And I want to come back to the question that was raised before, how do we go on? Many of you may be aware that there's a current current steps are undertaken by the government of Vanuatu to seek an advisory opinion by the YCJ, the International Court of Justice. And as we were asking ourselves, how can we go on? I look at all the nationalities that are here in this room, and so this would be a very clear opportunity to take on steps on human rights or on climate-induced human rights violations by lobbying your government to support for the next General Assembly of the United Nations this vote by the Vanuatu government. So this could be something very concrete, and gives us also, not only as NGOs, but also as representatives of parties, etc., so the possibility to lobby also our government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 5 more minutes before the end of the discussion, so what I suggest is that each of the reporters take 1 or 2 minutes to answer these 3 different questions. I suggest to begin online with Stelina. Do you want to react? We don't hear you. Oh, yes, okay, that's fine.
So no, I just want to add as an immediate measure to raise the human rights standard or try to bring the human rights concern. See, international level, yes, definitely there are options. We have the expert committees or the conventions, like, you know, the young children's representation to the CRC. But ultimately, when it comes to the implementation of international law, the states has to implement it at a domestic level. So I think a lot of these the rights integration issues will be played out in the domestic regime. So despite the fact that most of these countries are signatory to these international law conventions, with even our current understanding of the linkage with the climate change and human rights, I don't think that immediate possibility of a legislative framework, at least in some of the jurisdictions, I don't know, there may be exceptions, but wherein, as a matter of fact, all the climate legislations brings in the perspective of human rights. But immediate way out could be the climate litigations, because most of the jurisdictions either have a constitutional provisions on right of environment or at least expanded it as part of the right to life. So I think that's the entry point, because it's very easy to bring in the concept of anything violation of a particular quality of a life as violation of a right to life. So I think climate litigation could be, in my perspective, the immediate vehicle through which the human rights integration can take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stelina. Anna-Lisa, you want to? add on that?
There is a lot that could be said. I'll be brief and concentrate my points on the momentum from a human rights perspective for climate action in the advisory opinion. I think that everything that focus our minds on the emergency is helpful. And I couldn't agree more that having an authoritative pronouncement from the International Court of Justice could speed up momentum. These processes are never fast or quick. And we certainly cannot expect the UN Special Rapporteur himself to single-handedly fix this problem for us. But I do think that it is important that all institutional actors have their eyes on the ball. And we can all contribute to that continued attention, because there's no one solution to the gigantic problem of climate change. But by focusing every institution and every institutional actor's minds on the problem, we can hopefully engender the momentum that we're looking for.
That gives us a huge responsibility,
Yes.
all of us. Good, thank you. Linda, your turn. Do you want to answer to these questions?
Yes, thank you. I think the question of balancing between development, human rights, and climate change impact, I don't think climate change and human rights should be balanced with anything. I think what we need to put them is to prioritize them, not to balance them with any other activities. If we can prioritize, economy, we can prioritize, COVID and public health. We should be able to prioritize human rights and climate impacts. I don't think, the states are having difficulties in doing this also because they committed in many international agreements, and also they committed in SDGs, for example. SDGs and human rights are in the same coin, and there's also climate action in SDGs. So what we need to do is to prioritize, and it takes more than just international agreements. It takes more than just state commitments. It needs to trickle down to the regional government, local government, and then to the people on the ground. I think that's the most important point when we're talking about all this in the international level. That's beautiful and grand, but what happens on the ground is like what determines everything, I think. So the balance needs to be here in within climate and human rights, and not including development, not including everything else. So development should balance themselves into green economy, so green transition. That should be where our priorities are, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very important point. Sébastien, the last word.
That's a lot of responsibility. So just very briefly, I think the point that was made on the existence of a normative framework that is already there. We have obligations. We have a lot of the mechanisms. That's a very good point, actually. And yet, we've heard from David Boyd during his first intervention, or in the discussion of Working Group 2, that there is a tremendous protection gap and a lot of lack of political will, of ambition, of support. So I'd like to take this question and really recognize that the normative framework is there because of the hard work of a lot of institutions, the UN committees, special rapporteurs, the Office of the High Commissioner, so many actors. There is one gap, perhaps it's on business and human rights. There are negotiation of a new legally binding instrument. There clearly the legal frameworks really need to be strengthened and better supported. So hopefully there we also will see some developments. And there I think European and Asian states could really proactively engage maybe a little more to support those negotiations. But we have a lack of political will. I think this has been discussed. And so there we know that political will is critical to really foster momentum for implementation. And one great example of how political will is achieved is, for instance, the work of Costa Rica, Switzerland, the Maldives, Morocco, and Slovenia in putting forward that recognition of the right to a healthy environment finally in October at the UN Human Rights Council. These kind of initiatives really get additional momentum, mobilize the UN framework. And so there we're really looking forward to seeing a similar resolution passed at the UN General Assembly this spring to continue to mobilize the United Nations. Also some progress at the Council of Europe, where similar discussions are taking place under ASEAN to mobilize states. But then still, with legal frameworks, what we need is implementation. And we have these implementation gaps. So just to conclude, I will say, again, a strong focus on all of the actors that help, that work with governments, that remind governments of their responsibilities critical. And just to name two categories that we've discussed a lot, civil society, community-based organizations, particularly the ones that really work bottom-up, work with a gender lens, support indigenous peoples and environmental human rights defenders, and also established already existing national institutions, including national human rights institutions, but also gender machineries, consultative bodies in governments to really continue to have this conversation focused on implementation, to build on all of those existing legal frameworks. So much work to do at this level. But hopefully, the fact that this is on the agenda of ASEM can encourage us and give us some hope.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this word. I think which conclude very well this session of reporting of the working groups. I would like to thank all the rapporteurs for their tremendous job. It's not an easy task to summarize such long discussions in 10 minutes, but you did very useful work, and I think the discussion was deserve an applause. Thanks a lot. I give back the floor to my colleague now, or do we have a break? A break. Let's have a break. Thank you. Well deserved.
All right, we come for our final. Okay, I have to wait for the music. I wait for the. All right, thank you. So we come to our final session. We come to our final session once everybody is seated. And this session will be the closing discussion that will be moderated by Rolf Ring from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And we will have diverse voices from human rights practitioners and organizations to discuss the opportunities and prospects of action that can be taken by these various stakeholders. I may from my side already say that from the previous session I take two conclusions. One is that we will write to the newly appointed Human Rights and Climate Change Special Rapporteur. I think that would be, so he will know that we have worked on it. And I also thank everyone for all those who said that ASEM and ASEF have a role to play. So we'll take that very seriously. Thank you. So Rolf, over to you.
Thanks very much, and welcome to this panel. And before I start with this, I just also want to thank, but I thank those who are behind me, and that's the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency and the European Union, who has co-funded part of this seminar. So that's recognized, and we have. 4 speakers, panelists for this panel, Mr. Eamon Gilmore, the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. Unfortunately, Eamon can't be with us physically or digitally due to an urgent mission to the Polish border in connection with the Ukraine situation. But he has sent an address which we will listen to, but unfortunately we will not be able to ask any questions to him. And then secondly we have Mrs. Imran Ashan, who is a lawyer and environment and climate rights specialist. She will be joining us digitally. Hello there, Imran. And then we have Mr. Roberto Yenu Cadiz, who is the Commissioner of Human Rights of the Philippines National Human Rights Commission in person, and also, last but not least, Mrs. Marie-Claire Graf, who is the Swiss representative of youth and of youth constituency of the UNFCCC. She will also be in person. There are a lot of acronyms, but I think we will. There hasn't been that many in this seminar, but this was the first. It's a very long one. But first, let me introduce Eamon Gilmore, who is the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. He's a former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And since 2015, he has been the EU Special Envoy for Peace Processes. And he is an adjunct professor at the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. And in 2017, he was the visiting practitioner chair at the School of Public Policy, Central European University in Budapest. So let's listen and see his message.
It is a privilege to have been invited to deliver remarks at this closing discussion of the 21st ASEM Seminar on Human Rights. Here in Europe, the world as we know it has changed dramatically over the course of the last few weeks. The events in Ukraine took many by surprise, and a humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in front of our eyes. While the situation in Ukraine will continue to be our primary focus over the course of the next few weeks and months, the climate crisis has not gone away. There is no doubt that we are in the middle of an unprecedented environmental crisis, with climate change affecting every region across the globe, in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. Climate change and environmental degradation has and will continue to have an adverse impact on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, the right to safe drinking water and sanitation, the right to food, to adequate housing, and the standard of living. The European Union recognises this and has made climate change a central element in its policies, both internally and externally. The European Green Deal, adopted in 2019, sets out a roadmap for a climate-neutral continent by 2050. It identifies biodiversity conservation as an essential objective for sustainable development at the European and at the global levels, and aims to protect the health and well-being of people from environmental-related risks and impacts. The EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy firmly establishes the EU's commitment to supporting measures to address the high risks of environmental degradation, biodiversity loss and water scarcity on the exercise of human rights. We are implementing this action plan mainly through our 143 EU delegations and the hundreds of member state embassies across the world, including in the Asia-Pacific region. However, the strength of our policies lies in our ability to cooperate with partners both at the bilateral and multilateral levels. Many actions are based on cooperation and partnership, and we need to listen and to work closely with other stakeholders, the UN, regional organisations, civil society organisations, and of course, our Asian partners, to improve and to address our common problems. Respect for human rights is already an important part of the ASEM partnership, with leaders of ASEM countries across Asia and Europe reasserting the universal, indivisible, interdependent and interrelated nature of human rights at their summit last November. I am glad that ASEM has also become an active forum for discussions on climate change. Asia is one of the world's most vulnerable regions when it comes to global warming and natural disasters, and is the source of over half of carbon dioxide emissions worldwide, with its global share having grown since 2000, accounting for almost all of the global increase in the last 2 decades. The theme of this year's 21st Informal ASEM Seminar on Human Rights and Climate Change shows that both human rights and climate change are an important aspect of our partnership. Last September, the European Union adopted the Indo-Pacific Strategy. Through the Indo-Pacific Strategy, the EU intends to increase its engagement with the region to build partnerships that reinforce the rules-based international order across global challenges and to lay the foundations for a rapid, just and sustainable economic recovery that creates long-term prosperity for us all. Our engagement will be based on promoting democracy, the rule of law, human rights and universally agreed commitments such as the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Indo-Pacific region is home to 3/5 of the world's population, produces 60% of global GDP, contributed 2/3 of pre-pandemic global economic growth, and is at the forefront of the digital economy. The EU is the world's largest trading bloc with transparent rules and regulations. The futures of the EU and the Indo-Pacific are inextricably linked given the interdependence of our economies and our common global challenges. Our approach to the Indo-Pacific region is one of cooperation and partnership. The EU's renewed commitment to the region is inclusive of all partners wishing to cooperate with the EU. We will adapt this cooperation according to specific areas where partners share principles, values or mutual interest. The strategy is an invitation to our partners in the region to dialogue and to address the issues at stake, upholding international law and defending values and principles to which we are committed, with democracy and human rights at the forefront. The EU Indo-Pacific Strategy highlights concrete actions in 7 priority areas, one of which focuses on green transition. As part of the Indo-Pacific Strategy, we will conclude green alliances with like-minded partners that have signed up to the goal of climate neutrality by 2050 and other ambitious climate and environmental objectives. Last May, for example, we signed the first such green alliance with Japan. Europe and Asia have a common responsibility for translating our global change commitments into reality and helping the most vulnerable. addressing the human cost of climate change and integrating human rights into our actions implies higher levels of ambition from all of us. It is only by doing so that we'll be able to fulfil our responsibilities towards our planet and towards present and future generations. I hope that today's discussion, and indeed the discussions which have taken place over the course of the last few days, will contribute to enhancing the partnership between Asian and European countries when it comes to addressing the impact of climate change on human rights. Thank you.
And then we thank the EU Special Representative for his address, and now it's my privilege to introduce to you Iram Ashan, and she completed her legal education from the London School of Economics and Political Sciences in the UK with a specialization in arbitration and dispute resolution. Prior to joining the Asia Development Bank, Iram practiced on contentious and non-contentious legal matters in Pakistan. In addition, she taught at various prestigious institutions. Currently, Iram is the advisor of the Office of the Compliance Review Panel of ADB. She previously led ADB's Law and Policy Reform Program with projects focused on environmental and climate change adjudication and enforcement, sustainable development issues, gender equality laws and access to justice for women, corporate governance, energy laws, and regional cooperation. Iram's work includes establishment of Asian Judges Network on Environment, 6+ green courts in Asia, and 100+ gender-based violence case court in Pakistan, the first such courts in Asia. Please, Iram, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me loudly and clearly. All right, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the 21st Informal Asia-Europe Meeting Seminar on Human Rights series. What a beautiful topic for this seminar, Human Rights and Climate Change. Hello, everyone. I am Iram Ashan. I am a development lawyer, and today I'm speaking with you in my personal capacity as a professional who has been working with the legal and judicial stakeholders for more than 21 years on environmental and climate rights. Today, I'm going to speak with you. I think last session touched upon a lot of human rights and climate change issues in detail. With my talk, I'm just trying to reach everyone's conscientiousness on this topic. I'm speaking about an issue that is very close to my heart, and I honestly feel that we don't speak enough about it, and that is climate change unfair? And if not, then who suffers the most? I think Ban Ki-moon very aptly said that vulnerable people suffer the first and the worst. I think it's not rocket science. We all know it, but we tend to ignore it. During my talk, I will also share some statistics and some facts just to highlight the importance of the matters that I'm discussing. First of all, let me set the scene by touching upon what exactly climate change means. Well, climate change has different meaning from different people. For some, it is just changing weather. You know, it's too hot today. These days, it's too cold unusually. But for others, it's a matter of life and death and survival. Too much water and people are drowning in it, or too little to survive. No food, hunger, that is a different meaning of climate change for different people. This makes climate change, of course, unjust. Those people who have contributed the least are suffering the most from its effects. You know, some countries in Asia are predicted to have 6 degrees centigrade increase. For Tajikistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some parts of China, it may go to 8 degrees centigrade, if not higher. Climate change then becomes unfair as well, because while rich countries can deal with rising sea levels and dying farm fields, poor people around the world are already having their lives upended, their human rights suspended by the killer storms, starvation, and loss of land and property. Climate change, because of all of these impacts, then also becomes a global threat to peace and security. Because of survival issues, hunger, famine, diseases, flooding, these are leading to migration and a lot of security and peace disruption. You know, Congolese representative at the UN Security Council said, this will not be the first time people have fought over land, water, and resources, but this time it will be on a scale that dwarfs the conflicts of the past. In 2007, US Military Advisory Board projected climate change poses a serious threat to America's national security. This was US in 2007. Imagine rest of the poor world in 2022, I'm sorry. COVID has taken away the sense of time and year. Now, if climate change is unfair, then who is suffering the most? Of course, the vulnerable people like children, elderly and differently abled people, indigenous people, women, transgender. Fact, in developing countries, women and children are 14 times more likely to die or be injured during a disaster than a man. What are the impacts of climate change on children? Let's talk about health. Changing weather patterns will exacerbate diseases or vector-borne diseases or waterborne diseases in children much more than adults, like dengue, malaria, cholera, dysentery. Climate change also speeds up the spread of pandemics, as we are witnessing right now. When hotter weather hits or deforestation happens, and animals who are deeply hidden in deep forests and sea, they come on land and get in contact with other animals on the land, and through those animals then in contact with human beings, and hence infections and germs spread and pandemics happen. And of course, these pandemics impact on more vulnerable people more heavily. In natural disasters, because of their smaller size and lack of physical strength, children cannot fight with floods or other issues. Similarly, the disasters leave them orphaned or subject to child labor or sexual abuse or human trafficking. The other impacts on children of climate change is malnutrition, which is much more high than adults in children. Education, access to education gets limited. For instance, in girls, when they are burdened heavily with domestic chores and taking care of ill elderly and children at home, they do not go to school. In post-disaster and migration and displacement situation, access to education for children also gets denied. Facts. Nearly 160 million children live in high or extremely high drought severity zones. More than 88% of the existing global burden of disease due to climate change occurs in children less than 5 years of age. Secondly, I come to the impacts on differently abled and elderly. Again, their diminished ability to adapt due to them being bedbound or unable to leave home, unable to care for themselves for reasons like dementia, degenerative diseases. Disabilities may limit communication, like seeing, hearing, or speaking, mental functioning limitations because of Alzheimer's, senility, dementia, limited physical functioning, climbing stairs or ability to walk. Differently abled people cannot respond to flood warnings, cannot act quickly enough to save themselves like the regular normal people with all the abilities. There's one interesting fact that an estimated 6 to 8% of disability adjusted life years worldwide are attributable to unsafe and inadequate water and sanitation. So we can see how it differently impacts on different people. More facts, 56% of those who died during Japan's 2011 tsunami were aged 65 or over. Climate change is having the largest impact on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. And within this group, 20% are people with disabilities. Impacts of climate change on indigenous people. And here I always say, mind the gap. And my friends from UK would understand this. The indigenous people live in close proximity with nature. Their lives are dependable on environment and land. Hence, if you take away these resources from them, their lives are completely abandoned, literally. Another interesting factor with indigenous people is that biofuels are considered as an answer to climate adaptation and mitigation, because it's cleaner energy source than other fuels. But because of biofuels demand, many biofuel production companies actually usurped indigenous people of their lands illegally in various countries. So even the solution of climate change can raise to a violation of human rights of a few vulnerable people. Similarly, some socially and economically excluded indigenous people also suffer a lot. We saw African Americans living in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Climate-induced migration, do not forget that. While a migration is a growing challenge, there isn't a single definition of climate refugee or climate migrant. And migration is not only providing an alternative space for certain people who are in danger. Climate migration also means that you lose your entire livelihood, your culture, your religion, your language, your dress, your customs, your norms, everything is lost. Therefore, we need to have climate migration with dignity. Kiribati has come up with this beautiful migration with dignity policy, and I think rest of the world needs to follow that lead. Lastly, climate change impact on women and transgender. You know, globally, it is estimated that only 10 to 20% landowners are women, and hence that limits their decision-making power and make them vulnerable to displacement and also trafficking because of that displacement. Now, because of crop failure, fuel shortage, water scarcity, women are suffering a lot of increased domestic chores burden. They have to walk extra miles to collect water for their families, increased burden of growing food and agriculture work, and hence they spend lesser time at home doing the usual expected home chores, and hence suffer with domestic violence. Also, in post-disaster situation, women suffer sexual abuse, trafficking, as well as unbelievable violence. Facts. An average of 77% of the fatalities were women in tsunami in 2004. And you know why? Because they did not know how to swim. 300% increase in new domestic violence cases after 2 tropical cyclones hit Tafe province in Vanuatu in 2011. And in COVID-19, domestic violence is called a shadow pandemic by UN Women. This is an imminent crisis situation, my friends, and I really, really want to raise an alarm that we all need to be on war footing to deal with this crisis. Having said that, the fact that we are talking about it in this auspicious seminar gives me hope. And as Paul Kelly very rightly said, from little things, big thing grows. So after giving you a doomsday scenario, I leave you all with this hope that we all just need to do our bit and the situation can be improved. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imran, for this sort of sad reality check and your sharing your insights. Next, I welcome, and just for household, as usual, questions from those with us digitally, please send them in the chat box. And then please also, you know the rules in this room. If you have a question, you approach one of the mics. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Commissioner Roberto Eugenio Cadiz to the floor. Commissioner Roberto Eugenio Cadiz was appointed to the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines in 2015, where he now handles business and human rights, sustainable development goals, crisis and conflict, international humanitarian law, and peace. He also supervises the Human Rights Policy Advisory Office. Commissioner Cadiz chaired the Philippine Human Rights Commission's inquiry panel, which investigated the impact of climate change and human rights, which pioneered the conduct of a global inquiry process for NHRIs, where hearings were conducted by their but their commission beyond the territory of the Philippines, an interesting development in the work of national human rights institutions. So please, Commissioner, welcome, and we are looking forward to hearing your insights.
Thank you very much. Good morning. For lack of material time, I would go straight to the points that I wish to make. During the first day of our seminar, Dr. Boyd essayed the negative impacts of climate change on human rights, the rights to life, to health, to food, to water, and to all the other human rights that we are familiar with. At this point, although many people were saying earlier that climate change is a nascent issue insofar as human rights dialogue is concerned, at this point there is really no more doubt that climate change is a human rights issue. And under international law, which includes, of course, international human rights law, as essayed under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on Civil Political Rights, International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the many treaties and conventions, states have primary duty to promote and protect human rights. Human rights, which we all know, are first indivisible, immutable, non-derogable, and universal. And states fulfill their human rights obligations through the organs of government, primarily through the executive branch of government. On the other hand, it is the mandate of NHRIs to help governments realize this obligation under international law. NHRIs remind and advise governments of their negative and positive duties to human rights. That is, their duty to not violate civil and political rights, and their duty to progressively realize economic, social, cultural rights of their citizens. Governments view NHRIs as pesky institutions whose purpose is to embarrass the governments. Let's be honest, in many jurisdictions and especially within our country, we are viewed by our government as a pesky institution, as obstructionists in achieving goals defined by governments. But NHRIs view governments differently. We do not see our governments as adversaries, but as partners in upholding human dignity, which is at the core of all human rights. In the ideal world, governments and NHRIs must move in step with each other, or as the Romans would say, pari passu. Reality is that governments are sometimes constricted by certain concerns when dealing with human rights issues. Especially when dealing with each other, due to bureaucratic, diplomatic concerns, trade agreements, and many other bilateral and multilateral considerations. And I suppose this is why ASEM was created, to sort of go beyond these restrictions. I note in the briefing papers the emphasis on the process within HM, which is informal. underscores that process, that this is informal. And I also noted during the discussions earlier that we largely adhere to a process governed by the Chatham rules. And this is to promote a more honest dialogue by trying to veer away from the rigidity that often governs intergovernmental processes. Unlike governments, however, NHRIs do not view the world from a geopolitical perspective. We do not see a globe broken into many countries. Rather, we see many countries united under one biosphere. We are not many peoples. We are one species, governed under one climate system. From our experience as NHRIs, there are many levers available within that mechanism for helping address human rights challenges, especially those challenges of transboundary character and imbued with extraterritorial obligations. And climate change is such a challenge. It is both a transboundary phenomenon and it has extraterritorial obligations. In 2015, we opened an inquiry which for the first time sought to examine the nexus between climate change and human rights in a global context. Our regular courts would not have been able to conduct such an examination just because of the many legal, technical issues that govern courts, primary of which is the issue of territorial jurisdiction. But NHRIs are not bound by such technical limitations. The Climate Accord calls for governments to cut their greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, methane, nitrous oxide emissions, through what is called termed as nationally determined contributions under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And the target set in this national accord, in this international climate accord, is 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. But if we look and cumulate the submitted nationally determined contributions, and even if we assume that such NDCs are complied with by all countries 100%, we are still on track at a 2.7 degree global warming, which is far, far beyond the target of well below 1.5 degrees centigrade as advised by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What do we do? Obviously, much collaboration is called for between governments and NHRIs. And in this regard, NHRIs are very flexible in conducting dialogues, in building consensus, in framing issues, in addressing challenges. An NDC process that is not inclusive and just is a recipe for failure. Governments will not be able to achieve their NDCs. If they do not assume a human rights-based approach for the determination of such. Bound together, NHRIs can assist governments in assuming a human rights-based approach to the determination of their nationally determined contributions. In particular, NHRIs can help assure that this process of NDC determination is both inclusive and just. So we propose, first, that an inter-NHRI climate action working group solely focused on the NDC process be formed immediately. And second, that a formal engagement be established between the inter-NHRI team and the intergovernmental team focused on the NDCs. And the NDCs should not be reviewed on a 5-year time frame. It should be revisited every year. And there should be regular consultations to keep this process sincere, honest, and realistic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Cadiz, and so for pointing out the important work of national human rights institutions and sort of the not envious position of NHRIs being sort of the punch bag between governments and civil society and other actors. It is sort of you have a space to maneuver, but it is a delicate balance, and at the same time fiercely defend the independence of your commissioners. I think that is well taken. Our next speaker is Marie-Claire Graff. Mrs. Marie-Claire Graff is the Generation Zen climate justice activist, youth advocate, and political advisor. She was the youngest negotiator and member of the Swiss delegation at UNFCCC COP25 and benefited from the female training conducted by Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. She was leading negotiations on action for climate empowerment and capacity building and assisting negotiations on gender-related matters and technology. Currently, she is working for the Climate Alliance Switzerland and is leading the parliamentary group on climate of the Swiss Parliament. Additionally, she is also serving as an advisor to the Federal Council, that is the presidency of Switzerland, and on national and international human rights, climate-related matters. So please, Marie-Claire, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for inviting and talking about the opportunities and prospects. And I would like to focus, of course, on Asia and Europe, but also as the youngest speaker of the conference, on an intergenerational approach. How can we intergenerationally work together? And with this, I mean all the generations living here now on the planet, but also the ones to come. We talked a lot about future generations, and also by in the input of Ms. ASEM, heard how we are overproportionally affected, how our rights are treated, and how we are victims of the current decisions. But I would like to have a slightly different view on young people and children, as well as future generations, because I do believe that young people are exactly one of the puzzle pieces we need to transform, to move forward, and also bringing hope to the table. Currently, we see the biggest ever youth generation. 56% of the current world population is under the age of 35, and with this classified as children, youth, or young adults. And I think there's an enormous power we are yet not using the right way to actually transform. But let me start with some concrete proposals from an intergenerational perspective. We talked a lot about future generations, yet I believe we haven't really listened to what future generations would like us to do. So let's do a very short imaginary play. And I know it's very late in the conference, but I would welcome you to close your eyes for around 30 seconds, and I'm guiding you through a few questions to imagine what future generations might want. So you can close your eyes. You can also keep them open if you wish, but I think it's easier to imagine if you have the eyes closed. So you're born in the year 2100, so you're a human of a future generation. What world do you want to be born in? How does this world look like? What is there, which is currently not there? What elements are still maybe there? What remains? How does this world look like? How does this world feel? Well, you can open your eyes again, and we are back in 2022 at the 21st seminar. Of course, it takes much longer to really imagine such a world and what future generations could face depending on where they are born. But it's an opportunity for you to really bring in future generations into the current thinking, in the current structures, and also really feel the urgency and not only talk about future generations, but really bring them into the room. And it can be very hard to bring them into the room. It can be very hard to also do this with other meetings if you're sitting there with your ministers or business leaders. And I'm doing this actually with businesses very often, and in the beginning they're all a little bit confused what this means and are a little bit like intimately kind of put in a corner. But I also saw how transformative it can be to really think or give space to future generations. And I give you two kind of opportunities, as we talk about opportunities, on how to do this a little bit easier. So either you can have an empty chair. There is like one empty chair, which is afterwards for me, but let's just assume this empty chair is for future generations. And if you have meetings, just put an empty chair there and give this empty chair, which depicts future generations, a little bit of time to reflect on what it could be. Otherwise, you can also take another item. I always have a panda bear, but you can also take something else, of course, to remind you about future generations and what they could think. And I think it can be really transformative if it's done in the right way, to not only talk about future generations, but actually bring them into the room and give them space to express itself. But not only talking about future generations, I already mentioned young people are an enormous source of power, of hope, and of transformation of ideas. And very often, young people are seen as either the victims or the one who are protesting out of the streets. And yes, that's right, we're doing this because we very often do not have access to effective policy-making decisions and participatory mechanisms which actually are taken serious and which are taken, or where there's an accountability scheme. So very often we see, or more and more often we see that young people are invited. I myself, as you have heard in the introduction, advising a lot of different policy mechanisms, working on a lot of policy mechanisms. I had the pleasure to defend the interest of children and young people for the last 2 years in the UN climate change negotiations. Yet very often the opinion of young people or the points of young people are well noted, and then the business went on. So what I would really like to see is how we can bridge in an intergenerational way and have an intergenerational leadership in decision making, where we are taking young people as serious as they have to be taken. Actually, in the Convention on the Right of the Child, the fourth right, is actually the right of participation. And I think we can all agree that we are currently very far from really implementing this right, especially in decision making. So one of the actions we also talked about in Working Group 1, but also it came up a few other times, is how can we really bridge this intergenerational gap there. And I think something very, very concrete for all the members of the ASEM. There are 51 members. There is the next climate conference coming up, COP27. It's going to be in Egypt. What if, let's say 50% of the countries commit to take a well-resourced young person to the delegation and give them a negotiation mandate and really take them into the negotiation? I'm not talking about the youth delegate who is doing the side events or doing the Instagram channel because we have the digital divide skills. So really bringing a young person, well-resourced, into the negotiation mandate and really give the young person also the space to bring in their own views, of course, within the framework of these negotiations. It's a very concrete step, and some countries are already doing this. And I think this would be really brilliant for coming back in 1 year and see how many countries actually have a young person in the delegation. So I'm going to mention 3 more points. One on, it was already mentioned as well in the rapporteurs, but the mechanisms also came up in the question. There are like so many mechanisms already there, but very often, unfortunately, for young people, they're not accessible. And they're not only not accessible because of language, but very often it's like the basic rights which are not given to young people. They're not even taken serious if they would approach a court or something else. So while we have already a lot of mechanisms, we have to really ensure that especially young people can access them and have the resources to also execute them. Also in a lot of court cases, of course, it's like very scary and young people cannot access what we already have. So instead of always think what additionally do we need, I also think it's very important to think what we already have and how can we actually leverage on what we already have and make it more accessible for especially children and young people. Also something we talked about, and I think it's very crucial and it unfortunately didn't come up in any of the feedback rounds, is that for many young people, and I don't have statistics on this, but I think that many people who are working in this field are also suffering from climate anxiety and have a lot of also issues when it comes to the mental health aspects. And very often we are hiding behind titles and behind roles and mandates and whatever to not really letting this very human and personal aspect coming out. But I think actually it's a great opportunity to give it room and to also address this in an adequate manner. Because it can be freaking scary to talk about this topic and work on this topic every single day. Last weekend I was in the mountains of Switzerland. The glacier which actually inspired me to take climate action is the glacier of Morteratsch, where you have some information boxes and you see how the glacier is shrinking. And I was standing next to the sign when I was born. And from the sign where I was born, you can't even see the glacier anymore. It's really scary, and I think it's a very important aspect also to treat in the conversation around human rights and climate change, that we really give space to this very existential topic. And I see a lot of young people who do everything they can, yet they feel very impacted or feel actually paralyzed by their climate anxiety. So I really hope that this can also be reflected in the notes and also been brought up. And this leads me to my last point about leadership and also what we can personally do, because very often it's like, oh yeah, personal action is great, maybe you can switch your shampoos and whatever, and it's all great, but I think it's not about this when we're in a climate crisis. And there's also like a tiny suggestion that we could have actually changed the title from Human Rights and the Climate Crisis, or to Human Rights and the Climate Crisis, because if you have been reading abstracts of the last IPCC assessment report, or the One Pride, a special report on the 1.5 and 2 degrees, you can clearly see that it's not just about the changing climate, because changing climate is something very normal, it's happening all the time, but actually we're in a climate crisis. So talking about leadership, and very often what I see when I also talk to senior officials, that basically the response we get like, well, this is not reflected in my mandate, or this is not what I'm supposed to do, or this is not in my role. And yes, I do agree, because all of these roles are based on the past. They're built on what we needed 5, 10, 20, whatever years ago, probably when I was not even born. But if we are now in an existential crisis, also as we saw with COVID, we had to come up with new committees, with new groups, with new roles, with new mandates, and so on. And we did this very, very rapidly. And what I unfortunately do not see is how this is trickling down when it comes to biodiversity, when it comes to climate. That roles and mandates are reflected, and I mean, it's great that we now soon hopefully have a human rights and climate change rapporteur, but it's 2022 and the climate change or the climate crisis already has very disastrous effects on human rights, so it's a little bit late, but anyways. But for all the already existing positions, really reflect on what is your current mandate, what are your current limitations and constraints, and we all have them, and we all have to respect them. But also really see what else could we do, and how can we maybe go into this gray area, where it's maybe a little bit uncomfortable, out of the comfort zone, and really follow what is the need. In the beginning, you had a very short time to create the vision or basically depict yourself when you would be born as a future generation. But what action would it need from you today in the position you are? And a lot of you are in a very influential position as well, or you have access to people in very influential positions. How would this future generation, this you who was born in the year 2100, want you to act right now? And I think there is a big difference. And again, I agree, it's hard, it's challenging, but I think it's exactly what we need when we talk about personal action. It's no longer about like just reducing your personal improvement, but it's actually like really taking up extraordinary leadership, unprecedented leadership, and encouraging others to do the same. Because at the end, we need to create a community of people, of leaders, who are really taking this crisis serious and acting as it is a crisis, and not just a changing climate. And with this, I think I would like to close, and thank you for your attention. And do not forget the future generations in your next meeting. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marie-Claire, for this another reality check and sort of pointing us to very practical advice on how to go about conducting meetings with the empty chair, bringing youth representatives in the core government delegation, I think, and sort of pointing to this. I think this is something which should be reflected in the conclusions of the seminar. It was very, very inspiring. So once again, thank you very much. And then over to questions, if there are. I don't have any questions yet from the virtual body. Do we have any questions in this room? Yes, I see my colleague Matt. And I see Frida as well. So Linnea, sorry.
Yes, so thank you all for this sort of closing session. I am interested, which might not come as a surprise to some of the people in the room, in asking something about loss and damage, because there is, as we've seen in a lot of these discussions, a sort of an inequity in what we're seeing sort of transpire, and because the people who are being impacted by climate change are often those who have been or who have contributed the least to its causes and have the least capacity to deal with the impacts as well. And at the same time, to go back to what we were discussing this morning, there's clearly a lack of political will to move on that at the international level. And so what I would like to ask is sort of how you guys see how this collaboration could contribute to making progress on loss and damage, if not in the international negotiations, in other sort of collaborative ways, or the ways that the participants that are here now could work on that, especially perhaps civil society.
Any one of the panelists wanted to have a go on this? Irum?
Well, yeah, very interesting and heavy question for which I think none of us have an answer right now, because loss and damage is one area which nobody wants to touch upon. However, I think forums like this, or organizations like ASEM and many others, can push this agenda very, very smoothly. And hence, I think it's high time that we increase these dialogues, this kind of seminars, and these kinds of seminars must result in recommendations. And I suspect that this seminar is also going to issue a statement. Loss and damage was also a very, very commonly asked question whenever I trained judges or prosecutors, environmental judges especially, who struggle to deal with this issue. Because while they sit in constitutional courts, most of them, they do not have the power to, constitutional courts cannot talk about damages and retribution and all. So yeah, this is one area I think which needs a lot of awareness raising, a lot of capacity development, and a lot of dialogue, policy dialogue. And in the last COP, actually, judges were brought as one of the main participants. I think judiciaries and dispute resolution bodies who are allocating damages, who are putting liabilities in order were never part of these international discussions or international dialogue. But quite recently, through the movement of Asia Pacific and international global judges and judicial stakeholders, they were brought on table in the last COP as main participants. So this is picking momentum. I don't have answer for you right now, but we are moving in the right direction. So that's something I can just say positively.
Thank you, Roberto, or having anything to add?
The loss and damage issue is definitely a climate justice issue. It's very, very difficult right now to operationalize how loss and damage may be compensated. But there are certain principles that we should not forget. The first of which is that those who contributed most to bringing this global problem, existential problem, those who contributed most to this, whether viewed as in terms of government or in terms of private or non-state actors, should contribute more. The other comment that I may make is this. The loss and damage issue is a backward-looking concern. By that, I mean you are looking at something that has already happened, damage that has been suffered by communities. And the resources for that is computing with available resources for forward-looking solutions. Forward-looking solutions meaning given limited resources, how do you deploy these resources in transitioning the global economy from carbon energy to clean renewable energy? Which do you prioritize? Both are equal concerns, but we have limited resources. That is one conundrum here. Because even if you keep on, I'm not saying that they should not be compensated. Victims should definitely be compensated. But if competing resources are funneled too much into that, then that's taking away from the development of from the transition from carbon energy to renewable energy. And if we delay in that transition, then you continue to inflict loss and damage on victims. So there are no easy solutions. There's a third issue here when you speak of loss and damage, which is the problem of what we refer to as scientific attribution, and also when you talk of private actors, scientific attribution and also legal causation. Right now, the state of science is not yet at that level where you can clearly establish a nexus between a particular damage. I'm not talking of a global damage. I'm talking of a particular damage to a particular community that is competing with another community that has been equally damaged by climate change. How do you now establish the liability of parties? For example, in one community that has been affected by extreme weather events, as against a community in another part of the globe that has been ravaged by typhoons. And when you look at scientific attribution, how do you do that? So this is another difficult issue. And also, when you look at liability, meaning legal causation, when you go to judicial forums, how do you establish a particular actor's activity to the happening of a particular event that resulted into an injury to a particular party. That's why the issue of loss and damage is such a complex and difficult issue to tackle. But I agree that the principle of compensating parties that have been injured as a result of climate change should, in one way or another, at a certain point in time, be compensated.
Thank you very much. Marie-Claire?
Yeah, I mean, much has been said. Maybe just quickly to complement that, there is enormous wealth of resources also among civil society, who have been also bringing this forward in the lead up to the last COP and really make it a make it or break it topic. And of course, or unfortunately, nothing really substantially resulted out of it at the last climate conference. That's why I also think it's very important to really build pressure on the national level, because at the end of the day, we're not going to achieve anything at an international climate conference if there is absolutely nothing on the national level. So I think it's an illusion to think that there is an ambitious outcome on an international fora if there is nothing prepared on a national level. And the second point, I think it's also very important to realize that also in the latest, the AR6 report, assessment report, that all the countries are going to suffer from loss and damage, but it's going to be on a different level, and we have different capabilities to also address it. But also in a rich country like Switzerland, we are going to suffer from loss and damage. It's there, and I think we also have to realize that no one is immune against it. And I think if we all realize this, that we are all victims of the same, I think it gives us also a different, the rules in the game change a little bit than only seeing, well, the small island developing states, well, they're going to suffer, and we have a list of all the countries who are going to suffer, and the others are all immune about it. And I think this is something which probably had the biggest impact on me from the last IPC report, really having the science that we are all going to suffer from it in every place.
Thank you. Matt?
Okay, thanks to all the panelists. This is a question for all of you, and probably a question for reflection for all of us in the seminar as well. We've talked throughout this past few days about human rights and its relevance to mitigation, its relevance to adaptation, and even just now in relation to loss and damage. And we've heard from all of these different actors about the great work that's going on with the judiciary, with youth, with national human rights institutions, and so on. But we're in a small room, although we're also connecting digitally, and the international level of attention to human rights and climate change, I think, remains quite small. Having been at COP26, for instance, there was a small number of actors who were really talking about human rights and climate change. So the question concerns how to scale up the very good initiatives that we see at these different dimensions of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, from local level up to international level. So that's an enormous question, and I feel maybe I put you on the spot a bit, but what would it look like if the initiatives that you're engaged with could be scaled, or how can you scale up? And we heard an example from Commissioner Cadiz about scaling up the work that you've been doing in the Philippines to an inter-regional initiative. What kinds of ideas can we think about to maximize the visibility and interactions around human rights and climate change at these different levels?
Thanks very much, Matt. That was not an easy question, as always, but can I ask, this is fascinating to receive instructions on the screen, but can we have a quick round of all the panelists? Irum, would you start, please?
Yes, I think that's a very $1 million question, as I always say, how to scale up these efforts. So I just can give you an example from what I do, of course, for my own personal initiative, which is establishment of the Asian Network on Environment. Now, what happened was that the judges actually reached to some multilateral development banks and said that while we really want, we adjudicate upon environmental and climate matters, when we were becoming lawyers, we did not even study environmental law as a subject. So our capacity is as little as that. And then now it has multifaceted impacts due to climate change. So what do we do about it? And that's when we held hands of we decided to work with judiciaries, because in Asia and Pacific, especially, judiciaries are very powerful for a simple reason that institutions are weak. Hence, judiciaries are not seen as a last resort, and people rush to judiciaries for violations of their human rights relating to climate, environment. So with their capacity building, we saw some seminal jurisprudence coming out of Asian judges, to the extent then one decision came out of Pakistan's High Court on a petition of a farmer, a small farmer, who said there's not enough water for my land. And the judge went into climate change issues and involved ministries of environment and all, and came up with short-term, medium-term, long-term solutions. So out of one farmer's petition, a huge jurisprudence came out of Pakistan. Now, this case was then looked into by other jurisdictions, and there was similar cases coming up in some other Western countries as well. It was quoted in US, Germany, and some other courts as well. So what I'm trying to say is that one single judge who had a green lens through awareness raising and capacity development, his word actually translated into some global action. So, these small initiatives have huge impacts if they are taken in the right decision. And that has been my belief. I always say, while it is good to do big things, but small steps are very important to initiate this big ripple effect. So this happened by just one judge. And similarly, when Asian judges on environment was talked about, many other, including Europe, reached us to say that we want to replicate this kind of a network in our region. So this also happened. And then a global judicial forum on environment was developed at a global level, on which the judges from Asia and Pacific also sat on the governing body. So this way, through a judicial networking, from national to regional, sub-regional to regional to global initiatives started. And now, because of this global forum institute of judges, judges were brought to the COP level discussions as well. So this is how I see replication and starting smaller and then going bigger.
Thanks,
I hope I've given some hope.
Roberto, very short, please.
Okay, scaling up, obviously, a very important initiative that can be done is an educational campaign, because half of the problem of global warming is not just the producers of carbon fuel, etc., but also the consumers. It takes two to tango. We see now in the present war that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, that which came after in the aftermath of COP26, and now that the oil supply is being affected, people are crying out for more production of fuel. Why? Because the sad reality is that right now our global economy runs on carbon fuel, and if you say that we should stop using carbon fuel, that's equivalent to saying let us stop the grinding of the global economy. And doing that would be productive of equally disastrous impacts on human rights. So this is one problem. We have to educate the people to reduce, to alter their behavior so that consumption is reduced. The other side is, but the good thing is that all the important actors are almost unanimously aware of the importance of addressing this problem. All governments are aware, and practically all the big companies are aware that they should reduce their carbon footprint. This is the good thing. The third thing is that we should now mobilize public and private sector funding to hasten the transition. That is really the biggest challenge now. How to transition the global economy from dirty fuel to clean fuel. That is the challenge. And all the investments, or at least most of the investments, should go there. And we should already stop funneling money on further exploration of fossil fuel. There's already a glut of fossil fuel reserves. These reserves will end up as stranded assets in the near future. So the smart, wise, and moral thing to do right now, instead of going for short-term profits by investing on fossil fuel, we should go for long-term targets of developing new technologies: solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and hydrogen energy. Because the technology is already there, but we need to scale up. And in order to scale up, we need massive funding. That's where the money should go.
Thank you very much. Very short, Marie-Claire.
Yeah, very quickly. I don't know if I would agree that all the companies in all the countries really understood the emergency, but we can talk about this later. At least it's like on their, I think, on their radar, which is already good. 2 quick points. I think one is understanding the role in the system and play it, not what is supposed to do, but what is needed to be done to meet the targets we have set. And just a very quick example, also because it came up before on the slides. For example, Italy, who organized the youth conference, it's not Italy's role to organize a youth conference. It's just not. And they organized the program, they invited the young people, and they wrote the outcome. It's not. But it's Italy's job, for example, if they really want to invest in young people, to give the money to the young people and let them organize their own conference, let them organize their own program, put the outcome together, and then write the recommendations. And it's Italy's and many others. Just because it has been on the slide and have been working on this conference, and it's not to bash Italy because they have also been doing great work on the other side, but understanding the role and not try to take over other spaces. And we see this also when it comes to indigenous peoples, that very often some sectors then just organize an indigenous forum and write the outcomes, instead of empowering the indigenous people to come forward with their own proposals and actually take the outcome and implement it. And we see this, unfortunately, very often with young people, and I'm very glad that in Working Group 1, one of the outcomes is about tokenism, because I think this is the downside of the youth empowerment we have been seeing, that there is just way too much tokenism, which is not going the right direction, and this is not what I also meant with intergenerational leadership, and actually how transformative it could be. And yeah, just the second part again, like on the leadership of individuals. And I think we really have to come away from what I'm supposed to do in my role to what is needed to be done in my role. And I know it can be hard, it can be terrifying, but this is exactly what we need. Because if you're not doing what we need to do to reach our goals, I mean, we all know what is going to happen.
Thank you very much, and nice, well thought final words. Thank you, Iram, for being with us digitally. We would have loved to have had you here in Luxembourg, but we'll make it another time. So with a great applause to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf, and thank you, the panelists, for their interventions. And I think like yet another session, very inspiring and with many ideas that we can take forward. But now I would like to, we come to the final session, and I will invite briefly Ms. Carole Dieschbourg, the Minister for Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development of Luxembourg, to give the closing remarks on behalf of the government of Luxembourg. And after that, also Mr. Habib from the steering committee for his final remarks. Ms. Dieschbourg, as I mentioned, has been minister since 2013, and for 2 years before joining the government, she served as a municipal councillor in her home town, Echternach. She was also a board member of her family mill business, the Moulin Dieschbourg, that was established in 1897, and she was on that until 2013. In December 2015, however, under the Luxembourgish presidency of the Council of the European Union, Mrs. Dieschbourg coordinated the position of the European Union at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, the COP21 in Paris. And she's a strong advocate for women's empowerment in climate action, the promotion and protection of human rights in national and international agreements. As I said, she will do the closing remarks on behalf of the host. Please, Ms. Tischberg.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big pleasure to be here with you in order to make some remarks, and I'm truly inspired by the panel discussion I now jumped in. Sorry for being late a bit, because I would have enjoyed to hear the full discussion. But I was in the governmental council, was a bit late because Luxembourg just decided to have a sustainability check for every new law. So that was the point I had to raise, because Luxembourg has a third plan on sustainable development, and we now decided to check all the laws, because sustainability is not coming by itself, as fighting for human rights, but also fighting climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and pollution. This will not come by itself without having everyone on board. So first thing to say is really it's not only politicians, it's really everyone, which means the whole of society. And there I joined the point of education, learning also from others. Learning from others also means taking into account how some of us, especially indigenous people, have knowledge to live in harmony with nature. Also build on the knowledge of women, empower them, for instance, in lots of regions in the world, and then build back better together. So first of all, let me thank you for the last 3 days of discussion, exchange, elaborating on concrete actions, which is of utmost importance, because making the link of protecting human rights and the climate crisis, but I would say the multiple environmental crises that we face is, for me, it is very obvious. And for everyone working for years in climate negotiations, so I follow them since 2013, you get a bit nervous because you're not fast enough. But on the other hand, you also see that there are results and that more and more people get aware of this important thing, that day by day, and that's also a very complicated situation that we are in, because I think the Russian aggression on Ukraine is now taking a lot of the attention of the governments, and it's clear we have to be clear in our way of judging this, in our way of helping those who lose everything, who are exposed to this terrible attack. But on the other hand, it's also important, and we had the discussion yesterday at the EU Environmental Ministers meeting, that we stick clear that we have to see that there is the environmental pressure, and that will not go away. So we have the short-term reaction on the crisis that will also, because it affects not only energy pricing, it affects also food systems, which will affect these immediately. And we have the long-term crisis, because the climate crisis already now is taking away homes from people because of flooding in the coastal region. It's taking away food security because of desertification, and it's endangering. So it's a systemic danger that we face by the climate crisis, and the last IPCC report really shows it really clear, also the interlinkage between the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss, and the severe effects that today, nowadays, by speaking here, lots of regions in the world already live. So this is a very serious thing, and since 2013 we tried as Luxembourg to be connecting those things, working together with associations, working together with partners, with partner countries, in order to really raise the awareness on the important link of human rights and the climate crisis. And I hope that we will manage to get more people on board. When we redesigned in Luxembourg our international climate finance strategy, maybe I do not know if you know what we do, but we do per capita a big amount of international climates. We are in coherence with which was agreed already in 2009 with the 100 billion. And we doubled last year the yearly contribution even more, so we try to do better. We do it on top of ODA. So we are the largest per capita contributor to international climate finance, and we really try to get people on board. And so we also elaborated a lot on the international climate finance strategy, because if you want to invest into people and into good solutions, because not every solution is a good one. If you look at hydropower, you also can endanger human rights by taking land. So it's important that you have a good strategy that goes into the direction to have everyone on board, to empower the, women, to work for a more equal society, for justice. And so that's why we tried to have all those transversal themes in our strategy. And this both in terms of impact on climate change, but also in terms of the solutions to the climate change. So the new funding that we have been dedicated is also dedicated to the issue of climate-induced migration. This is something new that was introduced, because we now already see that a lot of people will not stay where they are. So, and last year, during the climate conference, I had the pleasure to negotiate the loss and damage, which is really an important file that we will have to speak far more about. And there you see that we are a very twofold world, and that we have to do much more for better understanding what this crisis, as a systemic crisis, will do. So we have introduced this, but we also have, as transversal themes, biodiversity protection, because it's about really linking the environmental challenges. It's by building up in a clever way on nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change and to empower people towards, for instance, a circular economy, which will bring us and also let us speak about the opportunities if we invest in people in regions that are endangered, where we can give them hope that they can build up a future, produce their own food. So I hope that this approach, and we also have a rights-based approach there, it's really important that this is not only awareness building, but that we integrate this in real political decision, and afterwards also empower our people to take the right decision if it comes to projects where we invest in. That's just a simple example on what we do. An inclusive and a holistic climate action, take this very serious, because a lot of people speak about sustainable development, holistic approach, and nothing's happened. It's really something where we have to get more experience with, and where we have to take people on board. Because it's, yes, a lot of businesses did a lot on sustainable development. But if you then compare, and we do this regularly also in Luxembourg, what sustainable development goals have been really introduced, then we have a lot of work to do. I think climate change is already in lots of heads because it's really a systemic risk. But the link to the well-being of our societies, and the link to speak about opportunities, also the opportunities to really work for more human, for respecting human rights, is not yet done. So we in Luxembourg try to have really stakeholders on board. And we engaged recently and launched a Citizen Climate Council, because it's about people, it's about the financial actors, the economic actors, and then lastly it's also about science, and science is quite clear about the impact of those environmental crises on us all. What happened the last years is not negligible. Sorry. very crazy word. No, but I think it's important because the principle of do no harm or do no significant harm that is introduced is really a step forward. Much happened also if it comes to human rights and due diligence obligations of companies, for instance, and in Europe we are really discussing now, because Commission has proposed due diligence, we are really discussing now in depth what this means. And I think yesterday we also had a discussion about, for instance, the batteries that we use, because it's a technology shift. If we use more electric cars, it's also important to have a view on the whole cycle and to not, by making this transformation to something which help us in climate, shift and have more pressure in other regions of the world on certain minerals. So really not losing out of sight that not every solution that we have is immediately also helping us in the area of human rights, that we have to take care to look very carefully at what we do. And yesterday we also spoke about the importance of forests, avoid deforestation, because in Europe we have lots of soya, we have lots of products coming from other regions of the world, and now tackling deforestation, imported deforestation, and working towards a holistic approach of environment protection, nature protection, and fighting climate crisis is also contributing to the human rights issue. The Human Rights Council, into a resolution that were adopted last year, regarding the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and by appointing a special reporter also made some progress. So I see that there's progress done, and some of you mentioned the late cases. I may mention maybe also in Germany, where we got a result by judgment if it comes to the climate crisis endangering future of people, which is really, these are strong examples of getting more human rights aspect, future aspects into these debates. So there I see really that we are making progress, maybe for some of you not fast enough. But I can tell you that if I would have said this also about how we integrate some of the actors in 2015 when we were negotiating in Paris, we wouldn't have been there. And that's really, and I think a seminar like this contributes really to enlarging the knowledge, to raise the awareness, and speak together in order to find solutions how to raise that even more. So let me thank for being here, for having used the opportunity joining us in person, but also virtually. I heard that there was really also virtual participation, and to contribute to the discussions. I would also like to thank, before closing, my colleague Minister Jean Asselborn, because I know he was here, and also the whole team of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, because they were hosting, doing a lot of work. And then also the guest speaker. I already had at Climate COPs the pleasure to thank Michelle Bachelet, because we made some events about human rights and climate crisis on that, so we try to every year repeat that as Luxembourg together with some partner countries. And and I was very pleased because I was already with her on those kind of events to hear that we had a very distinguished panel here, having Michelle Bachelet and David Boyd. So they addressed in a keynote, so I think this was very good, so I hope that this seminar helped to really raise the issue. And I also hope, so that's my last point, that you had the time to discover a bit of Luxembourg, which is far more than a town, because lots of people coming to Luxembourg just tell me, oh, you're very small. And I think, yes, we are small. But on the other hand, if we join forces with everyone here and we fight, even the smallest rice grain, I compared it once to that, can make a big difference. And that's, I think, the biggest message. It was spoken about small farmers, about young people going to court and wanting to have their rights. And I think that's the difference. If all the people raise their hands and work together, we will be able to build better, and we will be able to work for peace, because that's what we want. And I think having peace and working for human rights is a noble cause, but also giving hope to people in this difficult time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Her Excellency, Ms. Carol Disberg, Minister for the Environment, Climate, and Sustainable Development of Luxembourg, ASEM Steering Committee members, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and of course our colleagues, the resource persons and expert panelists during these 3 days seminars. A very good afternoon to you all, and first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this event. Amidst of all those challenges, you have arranged a very important and comprehensive program on human rights and climate change with excellent contribution from the distinguished speakers. I'm very happy that we can finally meet in person after a fully virtual seminar last year. This year marks the 25th year since the first ASEM Human Rights Seminar was first held in London in 1997. In this slide, I would like to congratulate the organizers for the tireless effort in planning and holding seminar each and every year, as well as ensuring the implementation of the seminar's recommendations. May this seminar will continue to enrich the global human rights discourse and inspire further collaboration and innovation in promotion and protection of human rights. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, this year's seminar theme, Human Rights and Climate Change, could not be held at a better time. Climate change is indeed one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing today. It continues to affect the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, such as the right to food, clean water, adequate housing, education, and right to development. The international community's biggest homework is to turn the tide on climate change and mitigate its impact, so it does not hinder the enjoyment of human rights. On the flip side of the coin, the international community also needs to ensure that any climate change response measures does not negatively impact human rights. This titanic task is becoming even harder given the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic impact of the pandemic has limited states' capability to implement its human rights obligations, particularly with regards to climate change. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during the past 3 days, we have discussed extensively about the complex interplay between human rights and climate change, and how to better integrate human rights perspective in climate change policies and actions. I will not give any recap on the seminar discussion because it has been elaborately explained by our distinguished rapporteurs, but allow me to lay out 3 key takeaway points from our discussion. First is that discussion on climate change and human rights cannot happen in silos. More often than not, human rights language is placed at the periphery of climate change and environmental discussion. In this regard, several progress has been made at the international level. For example, in 2021, the Human Rights Council passed a landmark resolution which recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a right that is important for the enjoyment of other human rights. The Glasgow Climate Pact, adopted as the outcome of the COP26, also stated that human rights consideration should always be at the center of any climate change actions and policies. ASEM partner countries should utilize this momentum to continue their endeavors in integrating human rights language in the climate and environmental policies, including at national level. Second, there is no silver bullet, one-size-fits-all recipe in formulating a human rights-based climate policies. Developing countries might face different set of problems compared to developed countries. In this regard, any climate action must take into account and respect these differences to ensure that no country is being left behind, and to ensure that climate change response does not adversely impact human rights. This brings me to my third and last takeaway point, which is multi-stakeholder collaborations at national, regional, and international level. Multi-stakeholder collaboration is key to tackle climate change and mitigate its impact without sacrificing human rights. Again, without sacrificing human rights. Inclusivity must also be the cornerstone of collaboration in surmounting the climate change, including with regards to vulnerable communities. In this regard, ASEM partners could continue to promote the strengthening of dialogue platform like this seminar to share knowledge and best practices in formulating human rights-based climate policy. Capacity building through technical cooperation and transfer of technology must also be encouraged. Furthermore, we should also push for increased participation from private sector in any climate action. As we are all aware, business have the responsibility to respect human rights, including those rights that will be affected by environmental damage caused by business activities. Going forward, I hope these takeaway points could inspire ASEM partners in promoting human rights-based climate actions, be it at national, regional, and international level. I believe the organizer will prepare a summary as the outcome of the seminar, and I look forward to receive the seminar summary. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, finally, on behalf of the steering committee, allow me to thank the participants for meaningful participation and contribution in the seminar. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your stay in Luxembourg, and I wish you safe travels home. And I thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. So, yeah, I have the final word, but that's it. So enjoy indeed, and thank you, Minister, again for being here with us despite the very busy schedule, and thank you also for your final words and of encouragement. So we will take all of this up and, yeah, enjoy lunch upstairs.